There we are. Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Lovely to see all of you. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special occasion here at the Korbel School, welcoming our newest faculty member, Carol Spahn, the Rice Family Professor of the practice. Really looking forward to the conversation. I'm Fritz, I'm the dean here. For those of you I don't know, I haven't met, but delighted to see such a mix of the community here. Some of our students, our faculty, our staff, and friends, all of you. So really a lovely occasion to welcome Carol to the school and to have a chance to talk with her this evening. As you see the title, Meeting the Moment, Leadership in a Turbulent World. That's really the title of a series of talks that we'll have over the course of the year, but no one better really to kick off that series than Carol Spahn. As you know, she was the director of the Peace Corps throughout the Biden administration until I think January 20th.
At 11:59 p.m.
When something happened that changed things. Really a remarkable career before that. You were interim initially at Peace Corps, and then I think you started on day one of the,
yes.
On day one of the Biden administration.
Much to my shock, yes. I did.
Which is, and we're going to talk about that because it was an interesting time for the Peace Corps, certainly. But really quite a moment, obviously, after the pandemic and all the Peace Corps volunteers had been pulled out, and then having to restart a pretty large organization. So we'll certainly talk about that and talk about more of the things you accomplished there. Prior to that role, more than 25 years in international development at several places, Women for Women International, Accordia Global Health Foundation, multiple different posts at the Peace Corps, including, I think, country director in Malawi, and indeed a volunteer in Romania, which I'll ask you about in a moment. And for us at the Korbel School, the relationship with the Peace Corps goes back many years. We were just talking with Karen Festi, who was involved with the first arrangement with the Peace Corps, but for over many years, so many returned Peace Corps volunteers coming here to get a master's degree. Indeed, during COVID, we had put a special offer on the table for Peace Corps volunteers. I think we had advance notice that this might happen, and we had a wonderful cohort of Peace Corps volunteers who decided to spend a couple of years with us, which was fabulous. And of course, DU and the Korbel School have also been a source of Peace Corps volunteers as well over the years. So it's a wonderful thing to have that long relationship with the Peace Corps. But anyway, welcome, Carol.
Goodness, thank you. And thanks to all of you. It's been such a wonderfully warm welcome to Colorado, to the DU community, to the returned Peace Corps volunteer community. I don't know how many returned Peace Corps volunteers there are in the room.
Oh, wow.
Many, many, yes. And
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your service, and I will just consider the rest of you future Peace Corps volunteers.
I think we're all pivoting into that now. Let me start at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as you want to start at, just to tell us a bit about your journey, and maybe starting with how you got interested in international affairs.
That's a complicated question, and as I was thinking about the bits that I dribble out over time, it really made me think about the totality of my 20s. And so this is for all of the students out there. I started my career in accounting. I was a financial statement auditor, realized very quickly that did not inspire me, but I think everyone should take an accounting class. Just for your future, it has served me very, very well. But at that time, and in this part I often leave out of the discussion, I took all the prerequisites for physical therapy school, applied to physical therapy school, and applied to the Peace Corps, and got into both. And I think about what those decisions are,
Wow.
those moments. And the physical therapy school would not defer my enrollment for 2 years. They would defer it for 1. But even that discussion, what if they had deferred it for 2 years and I left the Peace Corps and came back and became a physical therapist? So you just have no idea where life will take you, what opportunities will be presented, where you will be thrust into a situation that you have no idea how you'll handle. And I think that's the journey of my career. But in the 20s, it was accounting, physical therapy, Peace Corps. After Peace Corps, I worked for GE Capital at a bank in Romania. So private sector development, went and got my master's degree, and from there went into international affairs and international development with all kinds of twists and turns after that. So I did private sector development, I worked in infectious diseases, I worked in women's empowerment, and each shift, each turn was a decision that was made based on some other aspect of life that is a turning point. And so I think at this moment when there's so much uncertainty, so much happening in the world, and you think about the choices in front of you, you just move forward, right, with what you have and try different things, and you never know how things will unfold. I never, ever dreamed that I would be the director of the Peace Corps. It never even entered my reality of something that was possible.
It's great advice in this moment. I was just with a group of people, many of whom have just lost their jobs and are trying to figure out what to do and how to pivot. And maybe we'll come back to that a little bit at the end, talk about the options that are out there. If I could just get you to say a few more words about the experience of being a Peace Corps volunteer. And so take you back to the 2 years you spent in Romania. And what you took from that, and probably you could say the same about all of the jobs you talked about, the things that you learned in all of those different ways and the ways in which in the end they prepared you to lead a very big organization, the Peace Corps. But say a word about their paths in life, choosing to go in the Peace Corps. How did that change you? How did that set you in a different direction?
Well, I'll just set the stage. So having grown up in the Cold War era, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union opened up, it was a profound moment in history. And I think about the moment we all lived through with COVID, where the entire world shut down and all of the borders were closed, right? And so at that moment, I really wanted to go and serve in Russia and, really understand what was the narrative we had been told, what was life really like, and how can you be part of this transition in this moment in history. And we ended up being placed in Romania. I was a small business development volunteer. And to be honest, I had, come from accounting in corporate America, and I really wanted to ditch all of my suits and wear shorts and a t-shirt and Birkenstocks and, dig wells for 2 years. Like, that's what I was thinking my Peace Corps experience would be. And I worked at a small business development consulting center, and I had to have my parents send my suits. Like, I wore a suit in the Peace Corps, which, just speaks to just the variety of experiences that people have. But to be in a place that I had heard so much about and that had been the prevailing narrative of my childhood, this Cold War era, and be with people who experienced communism and were in this pivotal transition, right? I was in Romania 4 years after the fall of communism there. And I just can't even find the words to describe sort of what it was like to experience that moment and walk side by side with people through that journey. And I think the skills that Peace Corps volunteers learn, and those of you who have served can probably relate to this, it is really leading with curiosity. It is trying to seek understanding. It is empathy. It is active listening, is all these skill sets and being flexible and taking different perspectives. which I think are skills that are so important at any moment in time, but particularly right now. So I think everything I learned about that moment, I think has carried me through so many different leadership challenges and cross-cultural moments, but also moments here in the U.S.
Yeah. And I want to come back in a bit to your interest in what is happening in the U.S., your interest in civic engagement, and maybe bringing all of those kind of skills to bear on some of the issues I think that we seem to have in this country at this moment. But let me before we get there, let me fast forward a little bit to your director, your appointed director of the Peace Corps. I guess you served then exactly 4 years. So day one, I guess it was January 21st of first day of the Biden administration. And at that point, in the midst of COVID, and the Peace Corps volunteers have all been pulled out, and they're all coming here to the Korbel School. We think of it as a great time, but maybe not what they had in mind. And then it fell to you to restart this big machine. And you've worked in the Peace Corps, you've had all kinds of experiences, but that was probably as big a task as any that you'd ever had to deal with. And I'm just take us through that, those first days and weeks and months of that time, and sort of how what you did, how you managed that.
First of all, are there any Peace Corps volunteers who were evacuated? Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you for going through that and being here today. That was a devastating experience. Peace Corps had never evacuated globally in its history. So we had protocols and procedures in place for country evacuations, very strong systems, but a global evacuation was never even contemplated. And, so I want to give a shout out to all of the volunteers whose service was really just disrupted on a moment's notice. And they were just called and told to pick up everything and move as quickly as possible to an evacuation consolidation center at a time when borders were closing and flights were being canceled and medical hubs were being shut down. But this was also a time when the pandemic had not hit many of the countries that we were asking volunteers to depart from. So many of them were very upset and felt they would have been safer in their communities. So there was a huge push. We evacuated almost 7,000 volunteers in 9 days while borders were closing, and that required just tremendous levels of coordination and, most importantly, trust and relationships in countries between the volunteers and their communities, between the Peace Corps and the ministries that allowed us to fly, or land planes and pick up straggling volunteers. So during that process, I was chief of operations for the Africa region. And we really, kudos to Ethiopian Airlines, who helped us with a lot of charter flights and other things. It was a major moment for the Peace Corps. And I share all of that to say that it was an existential moment, right? It was a moment where you say, what is the Peace Corps without volunteers? And how do you maintain any relevance when your core mission has just been completely disrupted? And so those first 9 months, sort of as I was sitting in Africa region, none of us knew. And you'll recall that time, we all thought we'd reopen in 3 months. So we set up systems for volunteers to say if they wanted to go back and reapply. And, we had all of these protocols. And that's where we focused our attention. And so when I took the took the helm in January 2021, 9 months later, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? That's when vaccines hadn't quite been rolled out, but there was the promise of vaccines. We didn't know how people who were high risk, could be treated or handled. We didn't know how different countries' protocols would impact our volunteers' ability to serve and serve safely. And we didn't know how to bring volunteers into service without potentially putting communities at risk. So there were all of these different factors that we had to consider as we thought about how we would go back and bring volunteers back safely. We wanted to make sure that countries had the opportunity to say, we want you back or we don't. And we needed to make sure that the service itself was relevant to what the evolving issues were without having a time frame. So a lot of these volunteers were evacuated and said, I'll go back. They were, oh, we'll go back in 6 months. Oh, it'll be 9 months. Oh, we're not sure. We might be leaving in summer of whatever. So what we tried to do was make the decisions that we could make. So in times of uncertainty, what are those guiding principles? And one of the key ones that we had to make at that point was we will prioritize countries that we departed from. So there was a list of 12 countries that wanted the Peace Corps back. And it could have been a moment to say, oh, let's reevaluate, the entire structure of the Peace Corps and where we are and all of those things. But we said, they made a commitment to us, we've made a commitment to them. And I think that's important as we think about trust and relationship building, in the context of today. So that was a major factor. But in the meantime, because we didn't know when we would be able to get volunteers back, we said, how do we maintain relevance today? Because I still have to go to Congress and ask them for a budget. And I'm asking them to fund us and our entire staff around the world, because we said we are going to keep our staff in place so that we can have operational readiness when conditions allow us to go back. So that was another sort of key defining point. And to go and make a case to Congress to say, give us the same amount you gave us last year, except we don't have any volunteers, is a tricky conversation. And what they ended up doing was giving us our budget, and then because the base budget is important, and then rescinding some of the funds that would have been considered, marginal volunteer costs. So that's how we navigated the funding environment. But in terms of relevance, we deployed volunteers domestically for the second time in our history. So the first time was Hurricane Katrina. But we recruited and deployed volunteers to support COVID vaccination efforts across the United States. So I had Peace Corps volunteers in my, essentially my backyard in Silver Spring, Maryland, who spoke Wolof and were, out in different communities encouraging people to get vaccinated. So using those skills. And we started a virtual service program, and that was at the request of the government of Botswana, who wanted help with their social media messaging around COVID vaccination. So we managed to do those things and to engage our staff in programming that volunteers would normally do. So sort of 3 things to establish relevance and then a lot of back office and systems work to make sure that people were, really using that time productively. But it was a challenge when your core mission, your reason for being, is gone.
Yeah. So you navigated that period, but then and I'm curious sort of whether it happened all at once or country by country as you restarted. What were the challenges of starting? I can imagine some of the volunteers had moved on, so you had those kind of questions. You had, as you alluded to, different protocols in different countries. You had to think about that. What were the challenges of kind of restarting this whole operation?
As you can imagine, so Peace Corps left 64 countries. And really navigating what was the environment in each country was incredibly challenging. But I have to give credit to my predecessor, Jody Olson, who set up a variety of working groups. And then we put together a very tight business process that really looked at what are the external factors that ensure the safety of our volunteers and the communities they serve. So every country had to go through this review of external factors. And then at that point, you could invite volunteers back. But between the time you invite volunteers and they show up in service is 6 to 9 months. So much can happen during that time. So we had sort of an internal factors checklist as well. And then, 2 months before volunteers entered duty, we revisited all of those external factors. So we really just had to put a very tight business process. And the group that sat around the table and said, we approve this country to invite, and then we approve this country to deploy, encompassed safety and security, medical, operational issues, the CFO. So it was a very clear business process that enabled us to go through that for 64 countries. And so there were, our first countries were Zambia and Dominican Republic. And, then others sort of rolled out as they passed those things. So each team was really focused on let's get our country, out there. And it took almost 2 years to get all of the countries back. And there were a few stragglers that had serious issues with their health infrastructure that were damaged by COVID, and we increased some of our criteria as well. So those were some of the really tough ones to get back to. But by the time I left, we were back in 61.
Back in 61. It's a testament to the value that these countries place in the Peace Corps that they, sounds like almost all of them or all of them requested that you come back.
All of them requested that we come back, which was really beautiful. And I think that's the ultimate statement to the value proposition that they wanted us there.
Talk about,
Thank you.
Talk about where the Peace Corps is today. We'll ask you in a moment about some of the other cuts that have happened to people who work adjacent to the Peace Corps around the world in international development. But the Peace Corps volunteers are still there, but there have been cuts, as I understand, in the administration. How's the Peace Corps doing?
Well, I'm sitting on the outside now, so I will share what I know, which is first and foremost on the budget, which is an indication of support. So Peace Corps is always really garnered bipartisan support, which has enabled us to weather a lot of storms. But the Peace Corps budget has been relatively flat for a very long time. So it was about $400 million in I'm now going to get my data wrong, 2015, let's say, for fun. And it's $430 million now. So that is effectively a 30% cut in the budget, just when you factor in inflationary terms. So Peace Corps has had a lot of support, and there's some, I called it quiet stagnation, of how that support shows up in terms of budgets and ability to execute, robustly on its mission. But Peace Corps is one of the few agencies in the Trump budget whose budget remained flat. So it remained at $430 million a year. So that is an indication of, support for the Peace Corps. There was a clear message that the administration did not want to pull any currently serving volunteers from service. So a commitment to the countries that we were in with volunteers and to the volunteers who were serving. So that's good. And it's my understanding that there are ambitious goals to, get from where we are now, which is around 3,000 volunteers in service. So remember, there were about 7,000 who left, during COVID. They want to get back up into the 8,000 range by 2030. So I take all of that as a very positive indication that there is commitment to the agency. It's here to stay. And, it is a positive way for America and Americans to engage in the world. That said, it also is not immune from a lot of the DOGE cuts in staffing. And so how you deliver on that mission, in a way that takes into consideration all of the congressional mandates and safety and security protocols that have been put in place and other things remains a question. And recruitment is a huge priority. And, that requires both funding and people. So I think there is some, there's concern about, how do we execute on an ambitious mission with reduced staffing? And remember, we'd already taken a 30% effective 30% budget cut. So a lot of what we did during the pandemic was systems work, standardization work, efficiency work. None of it glamorous, but I will tell you as a former back office person, incredibly important. So we did a lot of that work during COVID to streamline, to modernize, to create those efficiencies, and then there's, more pressure on top of that. So it's a difficult time, and, I think we're very happy to be here.
Well, Peace Corps fared better than some other, as I said, adjacent agencies. And so maybe I'll get you to sort of widen the aperture a little bit and talk about American development policy more generally. As I was just with a group of people, as I mentioned earlier, who many of whom have just lost their jobs at USAID, have been doing interviews with a number of our alums who've lost their job there or at state or elsewhere in this area. Peace Corps has been an interesting part, presumably, of that whole ecosystem of agencies, NGOs, and others who are out there. But and I suspect many of those people were also Peace Corps volunteers. That's how they got into this business. So as you look, I know, and you're going to be teaching a course here, I think, on the future of development. So sign up, students who are here. As you stepping back and looking at the big picture and what is happening, what are your reflections? I mean, how much damage has been done? What is the cost to not just to obviously to the countries that we were serving through these programs like PEPFAR and others, but also the subject of conversations we've been having about maybe the cost to the U.S. of this rather abrupt changes. So what can you say about all of that?
That was a really easy question. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I think I layered in about 5 in there, so that, yeah.
Boy, there are so many things to factor in here. One is the human cost and the immediate human cost, and then there is, what is the cost for the U.S. in terms of diplomacy, soft power, trust, and how do we think about our role in the world? And what's the role of government? What's the role of philanthropies? What's the role of the private sector? So, there are so many layers to this, but I don't think any of us could have imagined that USAID would be dismantled within an 8-month period. Something, an institution that has done so much good in the world over the last 60 years. And you can take issue with any number of things. You can critique, post-colonial, approaches, and take issue with many different aspects of any enterprise, right, that seeks to do good in a very complex world. And we need to continue to do that, right? We need to continue to understand what was working, what's not working, and but this level of disruption and this level of abruptness is not strategic. It was a strategic choice to dismantle USAID with the speed, at which it happened. It is very difficult to make systemic changes in a way that is gradual, right? And so the abrupt dismantling of USAID I think Lancet came out and said that USAID had saved 90 million lives over the last 20 years. And the dismantling will cause the loss of 14 million lives by 2030. Those are numbers, big numbers. But when you think about what that looks like on the ground, and when you think about the people you brought up, PEPFAR, massive investment by the United States, the largest investment in a single disease outside of our own borders in history with broad bipartisan support. And here's a program that over decades has brought together scientists, researchers, practitioners, advocates, people at the ground level, reducing stigma, all of these things, and tremendous, tremendous gains. And some of the poorest countries in the world were close to or at epidemic control. That is beautiful. And to see that investment shortchanged at this pivotal moment when we're right at the cusp of turning the tide just exposes so many challenges as we move forward, right? And especially with something like global health. But you can apply that in so many other different areas. So had we taken a more measured, strategic, slower approach, I think we could have worked with governments to navigate those shifts. But as we just pull out, we are leaving host country governments holding a bag that they weren't prepared to hold and that they don't have the resources to hold because they hadn't planned for that, right? So when you think about then the long-term goodwill, diplomacy, trust, all of those are anchored on a shared understanding that, we will be working together, that we will follow through on our promises where commitments have been made. And so, the immediate impacts on people around the world is just mind-blowing and devastating. The longer-term impacts on our diplomacy and our relationships around the world, we don't know what that will mean. And that will take a long time to play out. And I want to share a story from the Peace Corps, which sort of points us in the other direction. And that's with relationship to the Pacific. So the Pacific is a very strategic region right now. It's a region that by many measures was neglected in many different ways. The Peace Corps was present there. We definitely pulled back from some countries for a variety of reasons over time. But these are relationship-based cultures and communities. So when the US went to the Pacific and said, what is it that you want? And there's a long list, but very high on that list was the Peace Corps and Coast Guard. Mm-hmm. Why? Because we'd been there. We had been there and walked beside them, and there was trust and there were relationships. So when the Biden administration hosted the Pacific leaders, so all of the leaders from Pacific Island countries came, almost every single one of them had a story about how, ma'am, if my English is bad, it's because my Peace Corps volunteer did a bad job of teaching me English. My brother-in-law married a Peace Corps volunteer who stayed in the country and helped write the Constitution. I mean, just amazing stories of relationships and connections that lasted decades. And that is what builds trust. And that is what, when we're negotiating across the table in a high stakes environment, and I've heard so many stories of that. On the one side was a State Department official who used to be a Peace Corps volunteer, and on the other side was a foreign minister who was taught by a volunteer. And that's what builds diplomacy. And so I worry that I worry that the trust equation, will be very hard to recuperate.
Yeah, we had, I guess a year and a half ago, we had a panel at the Aspen Security Forum on soft power, and Joe Nye was there. Joe Nye just coined the phrase, passed away in the past year. And it was actually, the theme of it was really around diversity as America's soft power, the ability to, but just to put in another term, what you're talking about. And it's lovely the way you make concrete what is often a very abstract idea, the idea that these relationships, even at a personal level, and more generally, attitudes, public opinion about the United States and are just huge assets in the world. And whatever else one says about this administration, it pretty much doesn't believe in soft power. And it is, as you said, about trust. Once lost, hard to rebuild. You mentioned just in passing some of the other actors who are in this space. So as we think about where we are now, not just in U.S. development policy, but of course there's been a pullback actually across the board in Europe and elsewhere, cutbacks in development assistance. As we look to the future, what roles do you see, and to what extent can the private sector, NGOs, philanthropies, other actors play to fill some of the gaps, at least that presumably are happening because of U.S. policy, but also I think other countries as well?
So I want to reframe that a little bit. Instead of filling the gaps, it's how do we create the new paradigm?
Yeah, much better. Yeah.
What I'm hearing from and seeing, especially in Africa, where I have more experience, is just a sense of pride and Pan-Africanism, and a real interest in different countries stepping up in a different way. And so I think as we look at how aid, we have a responsibility, I believe, as Americans, as one of the richest countries in the world, to support countries that are not, and are struggling and have both humanitarian and other crises. The question is, what is the most effective way to do that, given everything we've learned, and how does that paradigm shift to take into consideration some of the power differentials that we know have existed for a long time? And what is the role of some of the other actors? What is China doing? What were we seeing even, 5 years ago, 7 years ago in Malawi and in other countries? As I was director, I had a lot of U.S. ambassadors coming into my office and saying, we really need Peace Corps and we need it now. It is imperative because we are losing the soft power battle, and the Chinese are investing in things that used to be our playbook, right? Mandarin language teachers exchanges to China, and at a scale that they couldn't keep up, that they couldn't compete with. So that's one aspect. But when I look at sort of where I think development is going at this moment, and where we look at it going forward, is really a lot of economic development. And, what is the role of investment in infrastructure, in private sector businesses, in job creation? And that some of those approaches, can be structured in such a way as to, be true partners, in that enterprise. And I think that will work well in some places, but not all. I was a country director for the Peace Corps in Malawi. There will be humanitarian needs, and we have to be really clear, that a private sector approach is not going to solve all of that. The other thing that we're seeing in philanthropy is certain philanthropies, Gates being the biggest one, saying instead of remaining a philanthropy with a big endowment and spending down 5% a year, we are going to sunset. So the need is so big, and philanthropy in many ways their role has been innovation, and looking at things with a very different lens, and then governments would step in to scale. Yeah. Lots of really great partnerships to do that. Well, if U.S. government is not stepping up to scale, what does that look like? And what does it look like if Gates Foundation spends down over the next 20 years? Is there going to be a new tech billionaire that then steps up to say, okay, I'm gonna do this next? Yeah. Right? It's not a sustainable, clear path because each individual will have their own lens on what happens. So I think being really clear about the U.S. as a nation and as a government, what is our role in that space? Everything's been disrupted now. It's being reshaped. But again, this is a moment in time. So how do we collectively come forward and say, this is the imperative, and here's how we need to move forward, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and you're pointing to just on the philanthropy side, I'm always struck, you think of Gates or Ford or, having these vast sums of money, and they are pretty big, but they're a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of this. And so as you point out, their role is to catalyze things, innovate. At the end of the day, to go to scale still takes public support. And I think that's the direction you're arguing for. And we have a conversation here. We'll try to catalyze that conversation about what that new paradigm is, and what is the case for the United States to continue to engage in this space. Because as you know, publics are deeply misinformed about the amount of money, for example, in the federal government that's spent on development assistance, and overstated by an order of magnitude. I mean, it's quite remarkable, the misinformation. Let me pivot into what may seem a different topic, but actually connects, I think. And because if one way to think about your career is very much devoted to service, to public service and to service of others. Into a kind of engagement, as you talked a bit about in the Peace Corps, the kind of skills, the kind of things it takes to be effective. And as you said a bit, those skills may be useful in this country as well. And just, I know your interests are deep interest in Africa and the rest of the world by nature of your career, but also I know you're really interested in civic engagement, in finding ways to cross divides here in this country. Say a few words about some of the things you're doing or hoping to do in that space as you're now relocated here in Colorado.
Well, let me start by saying I got in my car in February with all of my earthly belongings and drove west. And so I'm very delighted to be here. But along that path, and I went down to Arizona and Florida and San Francisco, sort of reconnecting with family, friends, listening, reconnecting with America in many ways, because I spent the last 2 years as Peace Corps director largely on the road, and asking a lot of open-ended questions because I knew my reaction to what was happening. But I have family and friends on all sides of the aisle, and questions like, how do you feel about the level of divisiveness? How do you feel about what Elon Musk is doing? How do you feel about what's happening here? And what I heard was some disengagement and lack of, I'll say a surface understanding, sort of repeating what they had heard others say. A sense of overwhelm. There's nothing I can do, right? A lack of trust. And what I started to do is dive in, and I'll give a shout out to my daughter, Emily, who's done a lot of work on social capital and connection. And so I started really trying to understand that space. And the WHO came out with a report in June that says social health should be at the same level as mental health and physical health. So what is the quality of our relationships? And it talked about social isolation and loneliness. And then I started to reflect on what was the Peace Corps experience. Right? So in Peace Corps, we ask you to leave your home, fly to a country you may have never heard of, live with a host family, learn another language, suspend yourself, and then go out and live in a community for 2 years. That is a huge ask in bridging across difference. And yet 240,000 Americans have done it. And we are good at really taking volunteers through a process of thinking about yourself, thinking about the perspective of someone else, right? A self-other bridge model, perspective taking, active listening, suspending yourself, leading with curiosity and humility, all of these things that are part of the ethos of what Peace Corps is about. So I started thinking about how can we bring that ethos here? How can we activate volunteers who have served before to bring that ethos out into their community? I don't think that our divisiveness is going to be solved at the national level. I think it's going to be solved by each and every one of us showing up in our lives in a different way and changing our everyday habits to support connection. And it doesn't have to be a big project. It doesn't have to be a big initiative. And I would invite all of you to think about what you do tomorrow and how you wake up and, are you on your phone in the line at the grocery store, or are you engaging with someone, a stranger, and have that moment of connection that research shows will support your health and happiness and lead to stronger communities. So those are some of the things that I'm wrestling with and thinking about how to contribute, to some positive direction. And I think in these times of tremendous dismay, despair, moral outrage, the moral outrage can consume us, right? But how can we find that something within us where we can show up in a different way, in a positive way, and spread that connection? So it's a hypothesis, it's nascent, and I just feel like we have to do something in this moment to change the tide and to reclaim who we are as Americans.
Well, you get a feel for why we're so thrilled to have Carol joining us, not just because of her expertise on international development, but on something close, I think, to all our hearts here. It's the project of restoring democracy, but of doing it and of figuring how to heal the polity, which is probably the greatest challenge we face. So look forward to working with you on that. Let's open the floor up for questions for Carol. We have a few more minutes, and then we'll break. But would love to give you a chance to ask Carol questions. Here we go. Thanks, Sage.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I've really enjoyed hearing you. I'm not really familiar with the extent to which Peace Corps had any overlap and integration and collaboration directly with organizations like USAID, and the whether. I guess my question is, I would like to believe that USAID or something with a different name but a lot like it will be back in the future and have the opportunity to go back to doing that good work and rebuilding those relationships. Do you feel that there is, or in what way do you feel that there is potential for the lessons learned that you talked about of finding a way to go back after the pandemic? You had infrastructure still in place. You had leadership still in place. They don't. They won't. Is there a role for Peace Corps, or what can what possible framework or remaining slivers of pillars remain for an organization like USAID to go back and rebuild when they don't have that infrastructure? And does Peace Corps play a role in that, or can it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of the linkages between Peace Corps and USAID, I'll say that roughly 25% and probably higher of USAID employees were returned Peace Corps volunteers. So the Peace Corps is very much embedded, and that ethos carried through into USAID. The numbers were staggering. It was very, very high. And USAID provided small project assistance grants to volunteers for community grants, very small, $5,000, $6,000, something like that. So those things are gone. Again, I want to stay away from the term rebuilding. The infrastructure is gone, and that is decades to replace. If we're looking at how we go back, Peace Corps is an independent agency, and that's something that we have fought for over the last 65 years. And there was a 10-year period where it was part of a group called Action. There have been various efforts to try to bring it under State Department or other things. But one of my favorite quotes about that is from former Secretary of State Rusk. And he sent a note out to all of the ambassadors, all of the chiefs of mission, and said, Peace Corps must remain independent, because to make Peace Corps an instrument of foreign policy would rob it of its influence on foreign policy. So the independence is critical. That was a very long way of saying that USAID is now part of State Department. And so the Peace Corps' role really has to be at the people-to-people level. And to try to, merge it in or somehow, utilize the infrastructure that's there to restore or rebuild, you have to navigate very carefully. All of that said, Peace Corps, particularly I'll go back to the Pacific, as certain Pacific islands didn't have embassy representation. So the Peace Corps country director would be the de facto representative of the U.S. Embassy in that country. And when the embassy came in, Peace Corps staff helped that embassy get started. They had the relationships. So there are operational considerations, and then there are sort of independence and mission considerations that have to be very carefully navigated so that they don't merge. Yeah.
Question?
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm really impressed by your sacrifices and your dedication to the work that you've done for the Peace Corps. My major question has got to do with what is the new policy direction for Peace Corps? That is one. The second also has got to do with, now that Africans, we are not getting funding from Peace Corps, how are you trying to help Africans to be independent when we don't still depend on aids like the USAID and other financial organizations? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. The Peace Corps will remain and volunteers will remain. And there are always questions, and there were questions about, could Peace Corps sponsor Africans to come and volunteer in the US or Indonesians or, people from the partner country? That is not authorized in the Peace Corps Act. So the Peace Corps Act is only for Americans to serve abroad. There is a provision in the Peace Corps Act for the Peace Corps to support volunteerism in host countries. So during my tenure, I was very excited to work with an organization called Core Africa. They were starting in Malawi when I was there. It was founded by a returned Peace Corps volunteer, but it was for college-educated Africans to serve in communities, learning human-centered design and other Peace Corps approaches, so that you're developing the resources, right, and the knowledge base in country for host country nationals. So Peace Corps has helped Core Africa get started in, I think, 8 of the 10 countries that they're active in. And during my tenure as director, we founded or started an MOU directly with Core Africa to look at things like side-by-side service. So there are different ways that we have to adapt over time to say the expertise is not, necessarily coming from the outside, right? But what we're doing is joining hands and going out to a community together and learning and growing and developing leadership skills. And I believe there will always be a role for bridging across difference, right? So the Peace Corps has 3 goals. One is technical assistance, and the other 2 are cross-cultural. So essentially for the countries we're in, to learn about America, and for the volunteers to bring the culture of that country back home. So those cross-cultural goals are equally important. They go hand in hand because you learn about each other by working side by side. And I don't think that mission, will become outdated. It's just how do you execute on that, and how can you do it in partnership and provide those kinds of opportunities for people, or work side by side with organizations that are providing those opportunities in a way that is allowable.
Questions we have? Go ahead, Fritz. Yep. Sage, I'll let you just. You have the power.
Thank you. I've been wondering, you were speaking about China and Africa, and the Chinese are making a big push in Africa as far as becoming a alternate source of funding and help for the Africans. Working with the Peace Corps, what did you see as far as the counter effect of China versus the effect of the U.S. in Africa as far as help is concerned?
Well, that's a very big question, and there are a lot of initiatives that are underway. What I'll speak to is just more of the grassroots. So China's done a lot of infrastructure investment, but that is not in the realm of sort of community development and, I'll say, hearts, right, and that longer term goodwill. What I was seeing in Malawi is a lot of investment in solar power that was going out, into rural villages. There is, as I said earlier, significant investment in language, in Mandarin language, in a lot of different countries around the world through the Confucius Institutes, and a very big investment in international exchanges. So bringing academics, leaders, students to China to study.
Thank you.
Do any other students have questions? Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have a bit more of a holistic question, if that's all right. I'm really inspired by your commitment to bringing the ethos of the Peace Corps into sort of the civilian level, so to speak. And I was wondering if you had any more advice on sort of, in like such a divisive time, on starting the conversation with other people who are on the other side, so to speak, or even just disagree slightly, like what your base level recommendations are.
Well, that's a big question. I'll share my experience talking with a family member, and I think this is relevant for all of us who have, family friends who are, come from a different perspective. And I think it's sometimes easiest to start with those people who we have that trusted long-term relationship with. And, we know that, we come from a similar background. We will, come at a conversation with respect. And I think the biggest lesson that I've learned is just leading with curiosity and not going straight to judgment. And in it, like truly in your heart, leading with curiosity. Because that can be the hardest part when your perceived value systems when it feels so diametrically opposed. And I can say that with the family member who I debate with the most, because he's the most open to that kind of dialogue, there are times still where he'll say, all right, I just need to leave. Like, we're clearly not getting anywhere. I'm like, no, stay. And we found some common ground, right? And then you celebrate that whatever common ground you can find. But I think you just have to be seeking understanding and not to change someone's mind. And I think that's where we just have to start. And there's a lot of research out there that you're very familiar with. And if you all have the chance, I recommend you watch the Netflix documentary Join or Die, where it talks about the decline in people joining, whether it's a running group, a bowling league, anything, right? People are not joining at the same rate they used to join. And why is that important? When you join and you show up at something week after week, and you're side by side with the person who, their kids, their family, and suddenly there is an issue that you disagree on, you have a different conversation because you're going to have to see that person next week, right? You're not in a separate realm. You're not, sort of coming at it from behind a screen. You're going to show up with that person. So I think we have to get back to some of those basics of how we show up every day, how we engage with people in real life, and how we establish those relationships so that you can have the difficult conversation and come from a place of mutual respect and understanding and curiosity.
Thanks. Why don't we take a couple more and then probably all the time we have.
Thank you. Thank you for the answers. I guess my question would be like, what is your advice like for how do you represent the U.S. I guess while abroad when you may not agree with the country? I'm wondering that because I just submitted my Peace Corps application. So,
Yay! What's your name?
Catherine.
Catherine, I'm so excited. Even the fact that you're asking this question means you'll be a terrific Peace Corps volunteer. Truly, I think that we have to ask ourselves those questions. And I think the beauty of the Peace Corps is that you're showing that Americans care. As an individual, you as an American care enough to show up in another country, learn their language, integrate, be with them, work with them. And so you are there as the best ambassador that America has. And so I think you show up with the authenticity that you just shared. And, Peace Corps is apolitical, very intentionally, but it doesn't mean that you can't, represent, yourself and your own views and bring that care and love to the world. Yeah, you're welcome.
Last question.
Okay. In light of it being a turbulent world and you giving your background of the Cold War, then you were in Romania very soon after the wall fell, does now feel more turbulent than the Cold War or before then? Or is it just the age of media? It feels like it's more, or is it actually more? Because, I talk with a lot of people, various age groups, we've grown up in different eras, and it's like people seem really more scared now, I think, than they did then. But I'm like, is it more scary? So just
It's a big question that I've actually been diving into, because my initial reaction was, But we've lived through these moments before. We've lived through there was a world war. There was a Cold War. I joined the Peace Corps before the internet. Yeah, let that sink in for a minute. Before the internet. That was only a little over 30 years ago, right? But the pace of change now is much faster. And, the combinations that you talked about, so the combination of AI, wearables, biotech, and all of the social media is very overwhelming. And I think I read that somewhere that 70% or something of employees feel chronically just overwhelmed by the pace of change. They think they can't keep up. And it's a legitimate feeling. I feel that way coming into an academic environment and, trying to absorb all that AI means in this moment. So in that space, I think it's even more important to really be clear about your values and really be clear about where you as an individual can contribute and want to contribute, and stay focused. Because if you get distracted by all the noise that's around you, it is very hard to move forward. And I think in the piece when I was talking to someone here, one of the most powerful metaphors for that I heard was here in Colorado on a rafting trip. And the guide used the term point positive. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like, well, don't look at the rocks. You don't want to look at where you don't want to go. Mm-hmm. You want to look at the path between the rocks, and you want to all be rowing in that path. And that was just very powerful imagery for me as I was driving across country and thinking about where can I contribute in a positive way at this moment in time. And we can't take all of it on. So that's my sort of call, to all of us, is find that path for you that makes sense and just relentlessly stay focused on where you can make a positive contribution, because it is overwhelming.
I love that, point positive. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Carol Spahn to the Korbel School. Thank you so much.
Thanks, it's amazing to be here. Thanks for coming out, everyone.